relate to Amish because all we do really is work and sleep, and we're not allowed to really go out and have fun.
Imagine growing up in a world where every major decision about your future has already been made for you. The clothes you wear, the technology you're allowed to use, the education you receive, even the person you're expected to marry are all shaped by traditions that have existed for centuries. For many Amish families, that way of life is not seen as restrictive but as a path to faith, humility, and community. Yet for Rosanna Miller, the questions that had quietly lived in her heart since childhood eventually became too powerful to ignore. When viewers first met her on Return to Amish, they saw a young woman searching for independence. But what they didn't see was the complex world she was preparing to leave behind. A world filled with customs, beliefs, and wedding traditions that remain a mystery to most outsiders. And once you understand those traditions, Rosanna's decision begins to look far more complicated than simply walking away from one lifestyle to embrace another. For generations, the Amish have lived according to a carefully preserved set of principles that place faith above convenience and community above individuality. While the outside world constantly embraces new technology and changing social values, Amish communities continue to protect traditions that have been passed down through countless generations. Their goal has never been to reject the modern world simply for the sake of being different. Instead, they believe that a slower, simpler life allows families to remain closer to one another and, more importantly, closer to God. One of the most misunderstood parts of Amish culture is marriage. To outsiders, wedding nights are often imagined as grand romantic occasions filled with luxury hotels, elaborate celebrations, and private honeymoons. Amish weddings, however, follow an entirely different philosophy. The wedding itself is usually attended by hundreds of guests, many of whom have traveled long distances by horse and buggy to celebrate the occasion. Because preparing meals and hosting such a large gathering requires enormous effort, the celebration often continues into the following day. Rather than disappearing to a honeymoon destination, many newly married Amish couples spend their first night at the bride's family home. For someone unfamiliar with Amish customs, this may seem surprising. Yet within the community it serves a practical purpose. Family members and guests often remain together well into the evening, helping clean, organize, and prepare for the celebrations that continue the next morning. Marriage is viewed not as the beginning of an isolated relationship between two people, but as the strengthening of two families within a close-knit community. Privacy, while certainly respected, is not emphasized in the same way modern Western culture often expects. The focus instead rests on commitment, faith, and responsibility. That doesn't mean every Amish community follows identical customs. One of the biggest misconceptions is believing that all Amish people live under exactly the same rules. In reality, practices vary from one settlement to another. Some families may provide newlyweds with greater privacy, while others continue traditions that have remained unchanged for decades. Despite these differences, the central values rarely change: humility, faith, community, and a lifelong commitment to marriage. Those values influence nearly every aspect of Amish life. Unlike many societies that celebrate individual achievement, Amish culture encourages people to place the needs of the community above personal ambition. Success is measured less by wealth or status and more by faithfulness, hard work, and service to others. This philosophy is guided by something known as the Ordnung. Although outsiders often describe it simply as a rulebook, the Ordnung is much more than that. It establishes the standards each Amish community chooses to follow. These guidelines determine everything from clothing and transportation to acceptable technology and religious responsibilities. Interestingly, there is no single Amish leader making these decisions for every community. Each district discusses and agrees upon its own standards, meaning what is acceptable in one settlement may be discouraged in another. Before major religious observances, baptized members gather to review these expectations together, ensuring that everyone continues moving in the same direction. The Ordnung shapes daily life in countless ways. It influences how homes are built, how families work together, how children are raised, even how neighbors interact with one another. At the heart of Amish society is the belief that strong families create strong communities. Large families are common, not only because children are viewed as blessings from God but also because family members contribute to everyday life. On farms especially, every child gradually becomes part of the household's shared responsibilities. Hard work is considered an important virtue. Because of that belief, certain technologies are sometimes viewed with caution. The issue isn't whether a machine is impressive or efficient. The question is whether it strengthens or weakens family and community life. If a new invention replaces cooperation with independence, many Amish communities see it as something that deserves careful consideration. That's why horse-drawn buggies continue to symbolize Amish life even today. Traveling by buggy naturally slows life down, encourages nearby living, and reduces dependence on modern conveniences. At the same time, many communities do allow transportation in cars when someone else is driving, and some have accepted practical innovations like electric bicycles to make daily travel easier. The image many people have of the Amish completely rejecting every modern invention is therefore an oversimplification. The reality is much more nuanced. Their clothing reflects the same values. Men typically wear plain shirts, suspenders, dark trousers, and broad-brimmed hats. Married men traditionally grow beards as a symbol of adulthood and family responsibility. One detail many people notice is the absence of mustaches. Historically, mustaches became associated with military officers, and because Amish beliefs emphasize peace and nonviolence, many communities avoided adopting that style. Women's clothing follows equally simple principles. Muted-colored dresses, aprons, bonnets, and prayer coverings are worn not as fashion statements, but as expressions of modesty and unity. Jewelry is generally avoided because it may draw unnecessary attention to the individual. Even something as familiar as a wedding ring is often absent. Instead of displaying commitment through expensive symbols, Amish marriages emphasize lifelong devotion demonstrated through daily actions. Many garments are handmade, although specific methods of fastening clothing differ between various Amish groups. Some communities continue using traditional hooks and eyes, while others permit buttons as standards gradually evolve. Food also plays an essential role within Amish culture. Meals are rarely rushed. Whether celebrating weddings, church gatherings, fundraising events, or family milestones, food becomes another expression of togetherness. Simple recipes passed from one generation to the next often fill long tables where relatives, friends, and neighbors gather for hours of conversation. Many visitors become familiar with Amish baking through homemade breads, fruit pies, preserves, pickled vegetables, and traditional desserts sold in markets and restaurants. Yet these meals represent much more than recipes. They reinforce the sense that every gathering is an opportunity to strengthen relationships. The Amish lifestyle also presents unique medical challenges. Because many communities trace their ancestry back to relatively small groups of early settlers, certain inherited genetic conditions appear more frequently than they do in the general population. Researchers have studied Amish family histories for decades because they provide valuable insight into rare medical disorders. Despite these genetic challenges, studies have often found lower rates of several lifestyle-related illnesses within Amish communities. Simple diets, regular physical labor, limited tobacco use, strong family support. Together, these factors have contributed to health outcomes that sometimes surprise medical researchers. Rather than rejecting modern medicine altogether, many Amish families seek hospital treatment whenever necessary. Specialized clinics have even been established specifically to serve Amish children facing inherited disorders while respecting the values of their communities. Perhaps one of the greatest misunderstandings surrounding Amish life is the assumption that its members are entirely cut off from the outside world. In reality, they regularly interact with non-Amish neighbors through business, healthcare, and everyday necessities. But maintaining those interactions while protecting their traditions has become increasingly difficult as modern society changes at a faster pace than ever before. That growing tension becomes especially noticeable during adolescence. For Amish teenagers, the years before adulthood represent one of the most significant turning points of their lives. Before they can marry or become full members of the church, they must eventually choose whether to commit themselves to the Amish faith through adult baptism. And for some young people, that choice becomes the most difficult decision they will ever make. one young woman would eventually face exactly that crossroads. Her name was Rosanna Miller. Raised in a deeply traditional Old Order Amish family, she spent her childhood surrounded by the customs, expectations, and values that had shaped generations before her. But as she grew older, curiosity about the world beyond her community continued to grow. What began as quiet questions eventually became a desire to experience life on her own terms. That search for independence would lead her on to return to Amish, and into a future that few around her ever imagined. But before Rosanna could fully embrace that new life, she would have to confront one of the most difficult choices any Amish young adult can make. Rosanna Miller grew up believing that one day she would make the same choice nearly every Amish young adult is expected to make. After reaching adulthood, she would be baptized into the church, marry within the faith, and spend the rest of her life following the traditions that had shaped her family for generations. In Amish communities, baptism is far more than a religious ceremony. It represents a lifelong commitment. Once someone joins the church, they agree to follow the community's standards, and leaving afterward can carry serious consequences, including being shunned by family members and friends in some communities. Because of that, the years leading up to baptism are incredibly important. Many Amish teenagers experience a period often referred to as Rumspringa, a Pennsylvania Dutch term commonly translated as running around. During this stage, young people are allowed a greater opportunity to experience life beyond their immediate community before deciding whether they wish to be baptized. Popular culture often portrays Rumspringa as a time of wild freedom, but the reality is far more complicated. Its purpose is not simply rebellion. Instead, it allows young adults to make an informed decision about whether they truly want to dedicate themselves to Amish life. Statistics frequently suggest that the majority eventually choose to return, receive baptism, and remain within the church. But for others, experiencing the outside world changes everything. Rosanna Miller became one of those exceptions. When she appeared on Return to Amish, viewers watched a young woman wrestling with questions that had likely existed long before television cameras arrived. Growing up in a deeply traditional Old Order Amish household, she respected her family's beliefs. Yet she also wondered what opportunities might exist beyond the boundaries of her community. That curiosity eventually led her to take one of the biggest steps of her life. She traveled outside the Amish world to experience what life among the English, the Amish term for non-Amish people, might actually be like. For someone raised with limited exposure to modern society, even everyday experiences can feel completely unfamiliar. Technology, modern fashion, personal independence, career choices, education, simple decisions that most people make without much thought suddenly become entirely new experiences. Rosanna wasn't simply chasing excitement. She wanted the freedom to decide what kind of future she wanted for herself. Her journey eventually became one of the central stories featured on Return to Amish. Unlike some cast members who were uncertain about leaving, Rosanna appeared increasingly convinced that she wanted a different path. That decision, however, wasn't hers alone. During her journey, she began a relationship with Johnny Detweiler, another member of the Amish community. Their relationship quickly revealed another difficult reality. While Rosanna seemed ready to embrace a modern life, Johnny struggled with the same questions that many Amish young adults face. Leaving meant far more than changing where you lived. It meant leaving behind family traditions, lifelong friendships, and the only community you had ever known. For many people, that emotional cost is almost impossible to imagine. Eventually, Johnny made his own decision. He chose to leave alongside Rosanna. Together, they began building a life outside the Amish community, creating a future that looked very different from the one both had been expected to follow since childhood. Their relationship attracted considerable attention, particularly because they openly challenged expectations held by their former community. According to the source material, their premarital relationship and Rosanna's pregnancy drew significant criticism from members of the Amish community, where such situations conflict with traditional religious values. Despite that criticism, the couple continued moving forward. They welcomed their daughter, Clara, and shared that they intended to raise her outside the Amish lifestyle, giving her opportunities very different from those they experienced growing up. Rosanna also adopted modern clothing and embraced many aspects of contemporary life. Yet one detail often surprises viewers. Leaving the Amish did not necessarily mean completely abandoning her family. According to the source material, Rosanna has maintained contact with relatives in Pennsylvania, showing that every family's experience can be different. While some departures create lasting separation, others allow relationships to continue despite very different lifestyles. Rosanna's story naturally raises another fascinating question. Who exactly are the Amish, and how did this remarkable community come into existence? The Amish trace their roots back to the late 17th century. They emerged from the Anabaptist movement in Europe following disagreements over church discipline and religious practices. A Swiss religious leader named Jacob Ammon became the central figure behind the movement, and those who followed his teachings gradually became known as the Amish. Over time, persecution and the search for religious freedom encouraged many Amish families to leave Europe. Large numbers settled in Pennsylvania during the 18th century, attracted by opportunities to practice their faith without interference. Later generations expanded into states such as Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and beyond. Today, Amish communities exist across dozens of American states as well as parts of Canada. Although many people speak about the Amish as though they are one single group, the reality is far more diverse. Some communities remain extremely conservative, maintaining strict limitations on technology and transportation. Others have gradually accepted certain modern conveniences while still preserving their religious identity. Even within these differences, several values remain remarkably consistent. Faith, humility, family, hard work, community. These principles continue shaping everyday life from childhood through adulthood. Education also reflects those priorities. Most Amish children attend one-room schoolhouses operated within their communities and typically complete formal education after the 8th grade. Rather than emphasizing university degrees or corporate careers, education focuses on preparing children for practical responsibilities within Amish society. Legal challenges surrounding education have even reached the highest levels of the American court system. According to the source material, the landmark Wisconsin versus Yoder decision affirmed the rights of Amish families regarding compulsory education beyond the 8th grade, recognizing the importance of protecting their religious practices. Another aspect of Amish life that often surprises outsiders involves economics. Many Amish families operate successful farms, woodworking businesses, furniture shops, bakeries, and construction companies. Their lifestyle emphasizes self-reliance, careful financial management, and mutual support within the community. Rather than relying heavily on commercial insurance, many communities maintain systems in which church members help one another during times of illness or financial hardship. This sense of shared responsibility strengthens the close relationships that define Amish society. Perhaps the greatest lesson from Rosanna Miller's journey is that leaving the Amish isn't simply about rejecting horse-drawn buggies or adopting smartphones. It means stepping away from an entire way of understanding the world. Every tradition, every family expectation, every community relationship, every daily routine, everything changes. That decision requires extraordinary courage regardless of which path someone ultimately chooses. For Rosanna, the search for independence became stronger than the comfort of familiarity. She chose uncertainty over predictability, believing she could build a life that reflected her own choices rather than expectations established long before she was born. Her story doesn't suggest that one lifestyle is better than another. Instead, it highlights the deeply personal struggle between honoring family traditions and following one's own convictions. For countless Amish families, their way of life continues to provide meaning, stability, and faith across generations. For others, like Rosanna Miller, the desire to explore a different future becomes impossible to ignore. And perhaps that's why her story continues to resonate with so many viewers. It isn't simply about leaving the Amish. It's about one young woman facing one of life's hardest questions: the choice between the life she inherited and the life she believed she was meant to create. Whether people agree with her decision or not, Rosanna's journey offers a rare glimpse into a world that remains largely hidden from modern society. It reminds us that behind every tradition are real people making deeply personal choices, balancing faith, family, identity, and freedom in ways that few outsiders ever fully understand. Sometimes the most extraordinary journeys don't begin with crossing oceans or climbing mountains. Sometimes they begin with a single decision to step beyond everything you've ever known and discover who you truly are.